Good morning, everybody. I see some people are still coming in, but we are starting the session now to be in time. So welcome to this first of two sub-sessions on the ecosystem-based management from a pan-Arctic perspective. My name is Louise Kiel Jensen, and I'll be your moderator for the first sub-session here. The planning of this session was led by my colleague, Hanne Jonsen, who could unfortunately not be here today, so I'll be moderating this first part in her behalf. We have had the honor of collaborating with Janne Haugen, Gro van der Veeren, Eva de Grey, and Igor Aulas on this session planning. So thank you so much for the committee for their valuable contributions. Ecosystem-based management supports value creation through the sustainable use of natural resources and ecosystem services, while also preserving ecosystem structure, functionality, productivity, and biodiversity. In this subsession, we will cover a broad range of topics, including transboundary marine protected areas, ecosystem assessments, and the governance of emerging industries like deep-sea mining. Each presentation will provide some valuable insight into the different facets of ecosystem management, featuring case studies that highlight both successes and some of the challenges that we still see out there. We will begin with a 15-minute keynote, followed by 6 8-minute talks. We invite you, the audience, to ask questions after each presentation, if time allows. To the speakers, you will be noticed when you have like 2 minutes left. We will notice you on 8 minutes, so that means you're taking your time for questions. Yeah, and if you run out of time, I'll join you on stage so that we keep time. Yeah, let's see. With that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Saskia Trubak, who's a marine social science researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research. She will be giving a keynote, and the title she'll notice herself because she changed it in the last minute, so I don't have the right one. And one more thing. If Steve Crooks is here, I would like to, yeah, thank you. Then I know. Okay, we are ready for you, Saskia.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm from the Norwegian Water Research Institute, actually. So my presentation today will be about the conservation pillar in ecosystem-based management, and I will focus on the progress that has been made towards establishing marine conservation in the Arctic. And I will start with some transboundary perspectives and then zoom into Norway and Iceland as case studies. So starting off, what is actually ecosystem-based marine conservation? The Arctic Council has been instrumental in advancing both the definitions and guidelines for EBM over the past 20 years. And very briefly, as you can see here, EBM describes a comprehensive approach where you basically manage human activities based on knowledge about the entire system and the cumulative pressures that affect the ecosystem in order to achieve sustainable use and conservation. And what is important is that you set ecological objectives for the ecosystem, because those will guide the planning processes, and it's important that the sum of the management interventions do not surpass the threshold of the ecosystem. In terms of ecological objectives, internationally and in the Arctic, those are clear. The Convention of Biological Diversity agreed in 2022 to the so-called global 30 by 30 targets, meaning that by 2030, 30% of the areas should be placed in networks of conservation areas. The Arctic Council has been the most important forum for collaboration and setting marine conservation high on the agenda in the Arctic. In 2015, they published a framework for so-called marine protected area governance in the Arctic that sets out a vision for cooperation. And I think that one of the most important sentences of this MPA framework is this one. The Pan-Arctic MPA network will not wholly achieve its conservation objectives unless it is integrated into a broader Arctic management regime, such as EBM. So what it means is that basically marine protected areas that are designated for the primary reason of protection, as well as so-called other effective conservation measures that might, for instance, be sectoral regulation like bottom trawling prohibitions, they form networks of conservation. However, the conservation objectives of these networks is also affected by what is happening outside in the wider seascape. So there is also a need for regulating these, for instance, through place-based approaches, as well as industry guidelines and codes of conduct. And in order to get this integrated system, what is needed is ecosystem-based management as a framework. So by ecosystem-based marine governance, marine conservation, I mean marine conservation that is embedded in EBM. And the Arctic Council has developed policy guidelines and frameworks both for EBM and for marine conservation. And on paper, those documents reference each other. But what is about the practice? My presentation will look into how these frameworks are integrated as they're being implemented, and if we actually are moving towards achieving a transboundary network of ecosystem-based marine conservation. So how can we measure this integration? A first element is that EBM is science-based. So it means that you need to know about the ecosystem when you want to designate measures such as a conservation site. And an important point is that ecosystems don't stop at the borders of states. So there is a need for collaboration at the scientific level to establish so-called integrated ecosystem assessments as a primary measure for implementing EBM. So the first part I will be looking into is the progress that has been made to advancing these assessments. However, the Arctic Council does not have a management mandate, and so it means that actually the implementation both of EBM and marine conservation happens at the national level. So I will look into 2 case studies and see how they actually combine EBM and marine conservation planning. So starting with, are we moving towards transboundary assessments? And that brings up a first question, which is a question of scales. At what scale should you assess an ecosystem and plan for conservation? When the Arctic Council in 2004 endorsed EBM as the primary governance principle, shortly thereafter they followed up on work to delineate so-called large marine ecosystems, LMEs. And these are based on geophysical and ecological processes, not on administrative boundaries. However, when we look into the policy frameworks that have been established for marine conservation, the 2015 Pan-Arctic framework is not very clear on the scale of implementation, saying that several spatial frameworks have relevance. However, 2 years later, in a workshop report, they refer to the LMEs, saying that large marine ecosystems should be used to draft the plans for MPA networks, kind of showing this link that you need to know about the entire ecosystem, knowing where you can place an MPA. And the reaffirmation to large marine ecosystems has also been made in the Arctic EBM guidelines published in 2019 that have been mainly crafted around large marine ecosystems as the primary unit of management, even though other scales may apply. So from an Arctic Council perspective, it's clear that large marine ecosystems are the primary unit of management, but there are also other scales. Then looking into the progress that has been made in terms of assessments. The Arctic Council and its working groups have over the years established many assessments, often thematic assessments about the state of the marine environment, but they use different scales, not always the LME scale. So the Arctic Council working groups have not positioned themselves as the main provider of integrated assessments of LMEs. But there is another institution that might have filled in this gap, and this is ICES, the International Council of the Exploration of the Seas. And they have so-called ecoregions that you can see here on the map. And over time, the boundaries of the ecoregions have been also aligned with the Arctic LMEs. And ICES has established working groups in these ecoregions that are conducting integrated assessments. So they're providing an important knowledge basis for the cumulative pressures that affect these ecosystems. But there are also other scales. For instance, OSPAR, the Regional Seas Convention, is also conducting assessments, but they operate more on a meter region. Here you can see shaded in blue the Arctic region of OSPAR. So looking at the picture of assessments, I think that there are different assessments and scales being used. However, there is a progress towards producing assessments at the LME scale, and there has been increased knowledge in science production about integrated assessments. And how can this transboundary information be used in national planning processes? I think that the Norwegian example is very good here. Norway, as part of its marine management, is also conducting integrated assessments of their marine areas. And first of all, they have subdivided their marine areas into 3 larger zones that align with the larger marine ecosystems. And they also use the transboundary assessments that have been produced by ICES to inform the national planning processes, which is a good example of how you get this integration from the transboundary to the national level. But science alone doesn't make management, so there is a need to understand more about the governance frameworks in place at the national level. Starting off with Norway. Norway has established a system for cross-sectoral ecosystem-based management of its marine areas for more than 20 years. And as part of the system that consists of establishing knowledge about the ecosystems that is then used in sectoral or in cross-sectoral planning, they also have identified so-called ecologically significant and biodiversity sensitive areas, which are here you can see in green on the map. So this is an important knowledge base that is created as part of the Norwegian planning system. However, what is important to know is that the Norwegian ecosystem-based management system is not legally anchored. So it's more a type of political coordination across sectors. And this also means that these EPSA areas don't have any legal protection status. They mean that there needs to be exercised caution when you operate in these areas, but they don't have a legal protection status. Looking into the legal conservation framework in Norway, this one is actually still quite weak. Norway has a law that can establish marine protected areas, but only in the coastal zone, 12 nautical miles. And in 2004, there has been a strategic plan for candidate areas for protection. But even though if this plan was to be implemented, it would only amount to 10% of protection and only in the coastal zone. Good news, however, is that last year, the ministry proposed a proposal for a new law that would also enable protection at sea, but it's yet to be enacted. And in the absence of cross-sectoral protection at sea, there's been a lot of focus on sectoral regulations, such as, for instance, using prohibitions on bottom trawling, and the government is currently assessing whether these can count towards conservation. But looking into the Norwegian picture, it's clear that the current absence of a legal framework to grant legal protection status to biodiversity areas at sea means that ecosystem-based marine conservation in Norway is not yet achieved. But on the positive note, the Norwegian ecosystem-based management plans provide a very good framework for national operationalization of EBM, and the new potential implementation of an MPA framework, legal framework, provides opportunities. Still, this integration does not come on its own, and there needs to be increased focus on the strategic planning. To get marine conservation embedded in the EBM framework would, for instance, mean to use the knowledge that has been produced as part of the management plan system and use it to guide marine conservation. The here in green EPSA areas are biologically important areas, and they should inform the strategic planning processes of marine conservation to, for instance, create a strategic plan of areas that should be conserved. Moving to Iceland, contrary to Norway, Iceland already has a cross-sectoral legal framework in place that allows to establish conservation sites, both terrestrially and in the marine environment. However, at sea, area-based management has mainly been seen as part of fisheries regulation and to improve the sustainability of the fishing sector. When it comes to ecosystem-based management, Iceland has made a lot of progress in the recent years to move towards EBM, also shown in a lot of political commitments and policy strategies, but there is not yet a cross-sectoral framework for EBM in place. But I think what is important to highlight is that Iceland has been at the forefront of terrestrial conservation for many years, and they have a very good framework in place to ensure strategic planning, which is the so-called Nature Conservation Registry. So this registry is a strategic planning approach to establish conservation networks of conservation areas. And so it's based on a scientific assessment of areas, and then the Parliament passes a resolution which of these areas should be prioritized for protection in the next 5 years. However, if you look on this map of the areas that should be protected in the next 5 years, there is no marine areas because there's currently no marine criteria in the scientific assessments. So looking into marine conservation and EBM in Iceland, it's clear that despite a legal framework, the missing integration of the marine environment into the strategic planning does not yet enable ecosystem-based marine conservation. But on the positive note, there is a strong sectoral or cross-sectoral legal framework already in place that provides opportunities, and a step to move towards ecosystem-based marine conservation would be to include the marine dimension and marine criteria into this strategic planning approach so that marine areas are part of the conservation planning. Coming to my conclusions, how are we moving towards transboundary ecosystem-based marine conservation in the Arctic? I think one of the most important points to take away is that EBM and marine conservation are not the same thing, but also they should not be regarded as disjointed policy areas, because otherwise there is a risk of having marine conservation that is not integrated in EBM and that is not effective. So looking at the challenges on the scientific level, there is still different scales, institutions, and obviously also data gaps remaining. However, on the positive note and opportunities is that over the last years, there has been increased focus on creating these transboundary integrated ecosystem assessments that provide a good baseline to start with the implementation of EBM. And ICES has been one of the most important institutions. But what is maybe needed to advance this more is more political support, both to support the establishment of integrated ecosystem assessments, but also to use them in the national planning processes, like the example I showed from Norway. And governance, that's a challenging one. So the Arctic Council does not have the legal mandate or management mandate, so it depends very much on the political willingness and the legal frameworks of individual states. And they are obviously very different, and there's a diversity of approaches. However, looking into the examples from Norway and Iceland, I think it's safe to say that at the moment, we're not yet at having a system for marine ecosystem-based conservation in place. But the opportunities is that we have something already that can be built on further. In Norway, the EBM plans provide a very good opportunity, and in Iceland, the Nature Conservation Registry is already a starting point for more strategic planning approaches. So building on these and embedding them in EBM is the way forward. But what is also needed maybe on the very end is more governance coordination between states, not only having collaboration at the scientific level to establish assessments, but also to work on the governance to kind of coordinate where you want to place your policy measures, where you want to have marine conservation areas, and also to share best practices. That was it. Thank you very much for your attention.
I should have had another microphone. Thank you so much, Saskia. Extremely interesting. Do we have one question from the audience? We do have. We have some microphones. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dorothy Dunkel from Sintef Ocean. Everything that you said to me is talking about marine spatial planning. So could you maybe reflect on that term and the role for Norway to use that as a policy leverage for ecosystem-based plus conservation?
Well, I think that at the moment Norway has been very clear not to use marine spatial planning as a tool. But I think it's clear that if you talk about area-based management measures and you want to decide where to place a conservation area, but also where you want to place economic activities so that they don't interfere with the MPAs, there might be a need for marine spatial planning. And in the EU, this is already being implemented, but it's also not kind of just working as a magical tool. And there is a risk that marine spatial planning can also be guided towards the economic interests. So I think even if one were to implement marine spatial planning as a tool to aid conservation, you need to have a lot of good ecological indicators so that you really get like an integrated approach. Thank you.
Thank you. I am afraid that to keep up the time here, I think that we should move on. I will notice that Saskia will be a part of the panel discussion that will take place later today at Arbejdskontor 2 from 3:30 to 5. So there will be some opportunities to ask her questions then. Our next speaker is Raul Primoserio from the University of Tromsø, where he is a professor. I think that your talk is coming up, and it will still be entitled The Ecosystem-Based Management in the Transboundary Arctic Systems. Yeah.
Thanks. I will open up with a comment to the previous speaker. I'm very pleased and thankful for the introduction of the instruments and institutions that are actually facilitating, promoting that international cooperation, which is crucial to sustainable management and the implementation of ecosystem-based management. Again, we will look into transboundary ecosystems and see what the challenges are at the moment, and how the challenges in ecosystem-based management or transboundary ecosystems are exacerbated by the erosion of international cooperation. So, international cooperation we've seen during this Arctic Frontiers Conference is at the center amidst the importance for the Arctic. It's testified by the attention that it has received during these sessions and side events, both yesterday and the coming events. In the context of management and ecosystem-based management, international cooperation is particularly visible, so its importance is particularly clear in transboundary ecosystems. And to fully appreciate and understand how important international cooperation is for the sustainable management of Arctic ecosystem, it's instructive to see what happens when we witness an erosion of cooperation. So we can start with a broad pan-Arctic outlook. I will then focus in the Barents Sea region and the Barents region for showcasing. But if we start looking at broadly at the Arctic, we see that on the one hand, different large marine ecosystems are subject to different governance and management regimes, as we heard also in the previous talk. That fragmentation in governance and management, but also in ecological objectives, does challenge the implementation of ecosystem-based management across the Pan-Arctic. But the other thing that is apparent in the map by Weinrich and colleagues is the mismatch between the administrative boundaries between nations and the ecological boundaries. Here they are shown by steeple lines that essentially identify what PAME had specified as large marine ecosystems, which are delineated by ecological principles, so essentially by ecological boundaries transition areas. That mismatch causes much of the concerns that we have when dealing with transboundary ecosystems in the context of sustainable management. So if we now focus into a specific area, so the Barents Sea area, we will see how the mismatch causes challenges to management, so mismatch between administrative boundaries and ecological boundaries. And we will also see how climate change, by shifting ecological boundaries, by shifting the patterns of biodiversity in our areas, by changing food web organization, really, in a way, makes the administrative boundaries, management boundaries, and scales even less pertinent, okay, to our goals of sustainable management. So here we have the former Prime Ministers Stoltenberg and Medvedev from the Norwegian and Russian side indicating the boundaries. Here we're looking at national administrative boundaries across the Barents Sea, and these are in a south to north orientation. And at the time when indicated boundaries, so the rationale for that, for the decision that was made in an agreement between Russia and Norway, was probably not thinking about biodiversity patterns, ecosystem structure, and concerns that the scientists eventually need to address when dealing with ecosystem-based management. That's understandable, but the implications we will see are quite concerning. Probably the erosion of international cooperation I was mentioning at the beginning can be epitomized by the dialogue between Stoltenberg and Medvedev that in the recent years has changed in tone, so we can almost measure the changes in relationship between neighboring countries through that dialogue. Now, when we think ecosystem-based management, what is in place today? So the instruments that are used, the type of focus we have is primarily on direct effects of human activities on ecosystem components. And so if you look at the different components, the circles with those silhouette of species, we're looking into biodiversity in different areas. And these areas within, for example, the Barents Sea, the large marine ecosystem, those areas will show different composition of species, different species being exposed to human activities, and those biodiversity patterns, those ecological patterns require attention when planning activities, for example, in area-based management. So these direct effects are cumulative, so there are several sectors, and cross-sectoral management or integrated management needs to account across the board for those effects on species. So it is natural to look into maps of where species are distributed when the scientific focus needs to then inform management. So if we look at the, for example, coastal areas, transition or ecological transition and boundaries can be found, for example, just northeast of Tromsø, where we are today. So we can distinguish between the more boreal composition of species further south and more Arctic species. And these are different characteristics, so they are more or less vulnerable to human activities, different environmental pressures imposed by human activities. There are also different functional characteristics, and they provide different ecosystem services. So the ecological scale and border doesn't match, once again, the administrative one. Now, so this attention on biodiversity patterns is one crucial step towards a more integrated perspective with regard to ecosystem-based management. Now, we can see a similar type of pattern within the Barents Sea. There is a zoogeographic transition zone along the polar front, so in this frontal area in the Barents Sea. And you remember the administrative boundaries that were being indicated, they are orthogonal to the natural ecosystem or ecological boundaries and patterns that we have in the Barents Sea. So that, once again, testifies how mismatches between management scales, administrative scales, and ecological scales cause issues, and those issues are complicated in the context of transboundary ecosystem management. So these are the scale at which changes in exposure to different human activities need to be taken into account with. The next step for ecosystem-based management, so a progress towards ecosystem-based management, takes into account indirect effects of human activities on the ecosystem. So these are more systemic type of perspectives. We now connect the species in the ecosystem into a wall. We know that relationship between species mediate much of the indirect effects of human activities, and that needs to be taken into account. When we then look into maps of food webs, these are spatial variation in food webs, we see the, again, mismatch between management scales and ecological scales. All this, we said, is modified, has been changed by climate change. So climate change, we've seen, has redistributed species, reorganized food webs in our areas. So there has been a change in the zoogeography and a change in the food webs that mediate those indirect effects of human activities, and this needs to be taken into account. Now, in order to facilitate this transboundary ecosystem management, then there have been in place, and the collaboration between Russia and Norway, for example, has been facilitated by collaborations within the Arctic Council, by ICES expert groups, for example, for the integrated ecosystem assessment of the Barents Sea, by Norwegian-Russian or Russian-Norwegian commissions dealing with environmental concerns and pollutants, dealing with, for example, Fisheries Commission. These have facilitated the cooperation between Russia and Norway when dealing with the transboundary ecosystem management and when moving towards ecosystem-based management. The problem is that in recent years, this erosion of cooperation have essentially has diminished the scope of those institutions and agreements, and that essentially challenges this attempt at not only integrating ecosystem-based management into management activities, but also at coping with climate adaptation. So the present state of affairs is this. We need to operate from the Norwegian side in a sort of blinded by some of the lack of international cooperation, and that is challenging our aims. So to conclude, the sustainable management of transboundary ecosystems is being threatened by this erosion of international cooperation. And the challenge is exacerbated by climate-driven ecological transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raoul. According to my time, we do have time for like one question, if there should be one. Yeah, there's one in the back.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I wonder, in the context of what you're talking about in terms of the diminishment of communication between the West and Russia, appropriately so, in my opinion, is the West increasing its capabilities both in terms of collaboration geopolitically and in terms of advancing the science capabilities so that the other half of the Arctic waters can be, information can be gathered that doesn't require a relationship with the Russian government? Thank you.
Thank you. So what is in place now is really trying to supplement. So given the void in or the reduced communication, it's trying to supplement and allow, facilitate communication and access to data. But this has been on the scientific side of the issue has been pretty much based on collaboration among scientists. So this is not being facilitated by governance or management institutions, and that is what is making the cooperation, if you wish, towards ecosystem-based management more difficult at the moment, at least. Okay.
Thank you so much, Raoul. I think we need to move on. Okay, you can get down there. And I have to turn here to our next speaker, which I was allowed to introduce as Aiste, who's a researcher at the University of Bergen with a talk entitled Blue Uncertainties, Deep Sea Mining Policy Processes in the Arctic Mid-Ocean Ridge of Norway. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Very exciting to be here. And microphone and stage always remind me of stand-up comedy, so I'll feel pressured to say a joke in the beginning, but I don't have a joke, so let's move on. I have an alternative title, which is Mitigated Till You Make It, which should make sense later on. So I hope by the end of this presentation, you will get a sense why this sort of empirical work that I will show you has some value, at least in EBM or in ideas of science for policy collaborations. And some contexts. So I will talk about deep sea mining developments. And this is a quote from Minister Terje Asland from last year, and it is representative of current political rhetoric, where we are told that things will be knowledge-based and Norway will stay a leader of responsible resources management. Also, the white paper that came out to inform the Parliament's vote to open the continental shelf for deep sea mining exploration and exploitation also promises us precautionary principle, ecosystem-based approach, and promises us fact and knowledge-based management. So there's quite a lot of promising, and it's quite positive. If you followed some things last year, Norway had a very active year. So in the beginning, the Parliament voted to open the areas on the continental shelf. Then there was a case in the court by the WWF, and then in the middle of the court, basically, we heard that budget negotiations meant that licensing was stopped for at least a year. So Norway was about to issue licenses for exploration. And Norway is in undiscovered resource stage. The main interest here, as we hear it, is on inactive vent mining. The Ministry of Energy is behind this, so they are like project manager. And I will focus on impact assessment, so what happened in impact assessment and how science and expert knowledge basically informed it. You can find a very nice timeline on the government's website. Things were very fast, actually. Everything started just in 2017. And just last year, you already perhaps saw the calls for exploration licensing. So a bit of methodology. What we did was we focused again on how experts and science knowledge is used for policy making. So focus on impact assessment as this main kind of document that holds things together, allows to develop these ideas, and documents are often heavily informed by different science reports, right, and expert reports. So I hope it makes sense why this question, because it feels important, right? We did document analysis. It's a well-established method in the context of our work, but in a very basic sense, it's just, looking at this document as a messy ecosystem and just trying to find some patterns, or in other words, just kind of taking things apart and looking how they work. And this is a bit in numbers, how it all looks. I'll just mention that at the bottom, I will show around 600 data points. So quantitative data points I can show you in one slide, but qualitative data points, it would be masses of text. So I will just give you a small sample tasting menu of what are those. So this is the document. You might have seen it. It's the impact assessment, again, produced for the continental shelf and for the purpose of deep sea mining aspirations in Norway, right? Since this is EBM session, so I will highlight a bit also the reports that informed the impact assessment. So that report is from UIB's Center for Deep Sea Research, and the middle report comes from Aquaplaniva, and then those both and a bunch of other reports informed the impact assessment. So we looked at all of those. And these are the results. So this is impact assessment as a single line. And you see a nice pattern of various uncertainties. And this is not so strange. I mean, this is very early process. There are so many unknowns, right? So these are different keywords at different frequencies throughout the document, that things were assumed, presumed, things were unknown. Estimations were made. So there's a nice pattern, but as scientists, we can't do much with the pattern. I mean, it's nice, but I can't tell you much about what it means, right? So to know what it means, we need to kind of look qualitatively how are those uncertainties presented, what it all kind of means. And imagine you're kind of flipping pages with me together in the impact assessment, and just we are reading quotes from it to get an idea what are these uncertainties and how they are treated. So the impact assessment says that there are great uncertainties, but what seems to be clear that there could be great value for society. And then there are a lot of uncertainties regarding profitability, regarding technological solutions, how to extract, regarding where these minerals would be used, what would be the final product. And impact assessment itself is presented as fraught with uncertainty, and there are assumptions have been made throughout. But for most impacts, the assessment suggests that there could be possible to take mitigation measures. And actually those measures, it says, could turn and contribute to sustainable development, which is actually, I would like you to see that critically, because it's quite problematic suggestion. And mitigation measures as well, then are told that they are characterized by great uncertainty, and there is a table that is kind of a pinnacle of the whole document, and this is just a snippet of a table, but the table kind of summarizes all the impacts. So this snippet shows you just impact of inactive vent mining to benthic communities. And this impact is small. And me and my colleague who did this work, we sat together and said, this is a bit strange because there are all these associated reports that I showed you in the beginning, and those don't say that. So we dug into all that, and we found that actually how they rationalize it is this one study done in shallow water, which is taken out of context, so it's not even relevant for this purpose. But just to recap, so basically there is a pattern of uncertainties, and I hope you saw that when we assessed this qualitatively, it looks like there is an attempt to just kind of fill in these unknowns verbally or throughout just assessment to make it more kind of not so scary. So we, again, sit together and say, okay, what these patterns mean? And we said, what makes most sense actually that there's a lot of mitigation work going on. So if you know, mitigation and impact assessments has very specific purpose to describe mitigation of negative impacts. But what happens here, we say actually, it's mitigation of all the unknowns, so mitigation of unwanted knowledge, uncertainties, they are filled in right there in the document before even knowing some of the answers. So there is kind of an attempt to make the whole impact assessment and opening process more smooth, I guess. And if we go back to political rhetoric, and this is why we call, in short, it mitigate it till you make it, there is a discrepancy between these promises about knowledge-based and informed process and what we found in the document. So there's still a lot of space to improve things, I guess, hopefully. And if we go again back to the white paper that was written up after the impact assessment to inform the Parliament's vote, it's again, there is a discrepancy between the promises that we see there, precautionary principle and knowledge-based approaches, and how that knowledge is used. So what we find basically is either purposive or unintentional misuse of knowledge or misunderstanding of knowledge. So there is still a lot of space to improve these science for policy collaborations, right? So some conclusions from this work. I think uncertainty is not something unusual. While it might be scary in political sense for people who work in politics, for bureaucrats, it shouldn't be scary, it's normal, right? And the treatment of it in this document is highly problematic and questionable, so there is still plenty of work that needs to be done. And I hope that for some scientists, this doesn't mean being upset and disappointed, but actually it motivates you to do more work and to maybe find new ways how to explain the work that it shouldn't be taken out of context, shouldn't be misused or misunderstood. And for EBM, of course, there's a lot of things to do because these sort of assessments is kind of a groundwork for EBM, right? So how do we do these things right, that they are working properly? Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer. And there's a QR code if you would like to see more of my work. My colleague Laura Drivdal, that we did this together, actually worked in the past with precautionary principle and research integrity. Very interesting questions. So you could look me up, you can find her, and it was a pleasure. So Q&A.
Thank you so much, Aiste. I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there. We don't have time to take them right now. I'm sure you're around for the conference later today, and we may have some time in the end of this session to have questions as well. We'll work with that. Until then, we will have Juliane Borke at the stage giving a presentation on a map tool developed in Norway for the benefits of the whole Arctic, I guess. Thank you.
Yes, nice to see you all. Welcome to this talk. Yes, I will talk about a map tool that we have worked on with a focus on the Baltic, but it's really a general functionality, so I hope it will be interesting also in an Arctic context. I represent Barentswatch, a cross-sectoral cooperation in Norway to collect, develop, and share information about the marine areas. And we have more than 10 years of experience in agile development of digital services and data sharing for lots of different end users. And we have been the technical responsibles for this project Nordic Spatial, which has been initiated by the Norwegian Mapping Authority. And we've had project participants from 7 countries all around the Baltic Sea. Yeah, we've already heard a lot about the ecosystems, seeing no boundaries, and we all know a lot about the challenges in our ocean basins, and the Baltic is of course no exception. And to meet the sustainability goals, we need to cooperate both in the protection of ecosystems and also in the development of industries. And that is both to identify areas of conflict, but also for opportunities for synergies. And if we cooperate, then maybe we could even try to protect the most critical parts of our ocean basins instead of sticking to 30% of each nation's area, even though that, of course, also would be good to reach. And some of the challenges in transboundary cooperation today, they lie within the complexity, as we've already heard, in different legislations and also in understanding each other's visions and intentions. But some other challenges also that much of the consultation in the marine spatial planning occurs late in the planning process and through formal documents in PDF format, and the neighboring countries have trouble having access to the data they need to get a good overview and understanding in order to give their input. And those are the ones that we're looking at in this project. Our idea has been to provide an open map tool where we can enable collaboration at the right level of authority amongst the practitioners and planners and stakeholders directly and also informally in an effective way already early in the planning process. And for that, the tool needs to be easy to use so that you don't have to be a GIS expert to start collaborating. And we need to integrate data sets from different stakeholders. Of course, we are aware that the basin level spatial planning is more a political challenge than a technical one, but we hope that a tool like this can ease the collaboration in different phases of the planning process. And in short, the tool gives the users the opportunity to make and save maps using both public data and some of their own data, and then sharing these maps with others with access control and collaborating on both editing the maps and by commenting. And I will show some of these features closer in a minute. And of course, for a successful cooperation, the data shared on the maps is essential, and it needs to be both trustworthy and traceable and up to date. And therefore, we have streamed the data directly from Emonet and Helcom, which are the marine data portals for Europe and the Baltic Sea, where the data is assembled from many sources and harmonized. As part of the project, some relevant data sets have also undergone an assessment of their FAIR status, whether they're findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the hope is that a presentation of this can motivate the data owners to provide data using these standards. But of course, not all data is shared with Emonet and Helcom, especially not in the early stages of the planning process. So it's been important for the tool also to be able to integrate data from the users directly and that the users can control the access to the data. So I have a user scenario here. You see Gustav from Sweden, works for the Swedish Energy Agency, and he's working on preparing new areas for wind farms in Sweden, and he wants some feedback from Danish authority. So he starts the tool, which really means he goes to this webpage and logs in, and then he starts just with an empty map, and he uses the layer manager to find the public catalog and adds data, some data from these two are examples from Emonet. Military areas, which are the red polygons, and wind farm polygons that are registered in Emonet, which can both be planned or existing. And the tool also indicates up in the right corner that he has some unsaved changes to his map, so you can save it. And up on the top left, you can also see which project he has saved his map to, Swedish Wind, and when he has a name for his map. He can then add some private data, which he takes from a GeoJSON file, and which are the green polygons. So those are the areas that Sweden has been looking at to maybe develop wind energy in. And now he has changed the view up on the left to the comments and versions section, where you can see his previous versions of the map if you want. So you have the version control and the history, and he can also add comments to the map he's working on. And now he adds a comment indicating that he needs some input, and then he can use the share button up on the top right to get the link and give access to Luna from Denmark, who then gets his email and wants to have a look in order to give some feedback to him. And she then, when she enters the tool, she has the exact same map view as he has. She can see the history, she can see his comments, she can add her own comments. And she also then thinks, oh, maybe I should add, in order to get the overview, I have to add some of the data from my country. She knows where the sources are, so she adds the gray-green areas of nature environmental protection areas, and checks out the border areas. And she finds an area where the proposed wind farm is right across the border from the Danish nature protection area, and she would like to comment on that, and she would actually like to propose a smaller area. So she can use a drawing tool up on the top right to make a drawing of a polygon very easily, save the map, and comment. Put a comment and maybe some map pins such that Gustav can easily find it on the map. And then next time Gustav logs in, he will see all these changes. So, as you may notice, there's nothing in the tool limiting it to transnational cooperation, really. So you can just use it in national cooperation with stakeholders or within your own agency. It's not specific for the Baltic, so of course. And it's but the most important is that it's easy to use, so you don't need to involve your GIS experts necessarily in order to show your ideas and propositions on a map. So that was it. It's free, so just test it out if you want. And yes, thanks.
Thank you. Juliana, this is not mine. We are on time, but no time for questions right now, unfortunately. It's a very valuable tool. We have another one in Norway that resembles this tool in the management system, which we enjoy. But coming back to maybe the Norwegian system, the next speaker is Per Arneberg, who will be talking about the tool he developed for assessing ecosystem status.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about an assessment we did on the ecological condition of the Norwegian part of the shelf ecosystems in the Barents Sea. And it's done with a method that we have recently developed. So first we divided the area into two, the Arctic part and the subarctic part, because the ecosystems in these two parts are very different. And as I said, it's a recently developed method. We have just at the end of last year, we published a paper describing the method, and here is the reference for those of you that are interested. So a few words about the method itself. So it's done by a panel of scientists, and for the Barents Sea assessment, I think we were 32 scientists in the panel. And it's following a strict protocol, and you can see here to the right is the protocol, the report with the protocol. We structured the assessment using the concept of ecosystem characteristics. And the idea is that by assessing the ecosystem characteristics, we will get an overall good assessment of the key structure and processes in the ecosystem. And the characteristics we are using here is primary production, and it's the distribution of biomass among the different trophic levels. It's the functional diversity within trophic levels. Then it's functionally important species and biophysical structures, so typically cod and capelin in the Barents Sea. Landscape ecological patterns, which is mainly sizes of habitat types in this assessment. Biological diversity and abiotic factors, which is also a part of the ecosystem. So when we are assessing ecological condition, we need something to compare the current ecological condition with. We need a reference condition. And the reference condition that was chosen for this assessment is called intact nature. And intact nature is a condition that is not significantly impacted by climate change and other anthropogenic drivers. So it means that what we are assessing with this reference condition is the degree of anthropogenic impact on the current state of the ecosystem. Now, you could think we cannot do this assessment by simply collecting data on the reference condition and comparing it with the current state, because we don't have monitoring data stretching back to the periods when the ecosystem was not impacted. So therefore, instead, we rely on using time series data, where we look at how has the ecosystem changed for the periods for which we have monitoring data, and how can that be attributed to anthropogenic drivers. Okay, so how do we do this? First, we develop a knowledge base for each indicator, which is a text for each indicator, basically addressing three questions. What are the main anthropogenic drivers as we know it from the scientific literature? How do we understand that indicator values change with increasing impact from these drivers? And how certain are we about this? Again, taken from the literature. And third, how do we understand the consequences of changing indicator values for the rest of the ecosystem, so the indirect effects, and how certain are we about this? So this is developed, and then we have the analysis of indicator time series, where we assess how they are changing. We relate it to changes in the drivers, and in that way we do an assessment on the extent to which each indicator has changed due to the impact of anthropogenic drivers, and also the importance of that for the ecosystem as a whole. Okay, so we do this for each indicator, then we are integrating this for each ecosystem characteristic. And for each ecosystem characteristic, based on all the information we have from the indicators, we do an assessment where we conclude whether there is evidence of substantial impact on the ecosystem characteristic, evidence of limited impact, or no evidence of impact. And this is a qualitative assessment where we also, the scientific panel, use all the knowledge that they have about the ecosystem and the importance of the different components. We do that for all the 7 ecosystem characteristics. Then we do an assessment across the ecosystem, for the ecosystem as a whole, based on what we did for the 7 ecosystem characteristics. Okay, so let's look at some of the data and conclusions from the assessment, and I will focus on the assessment for the Arctic part only, because we don't have time to go into both. So one conclusion is that the climate and physical environment is substantially impacted by anthropogenic drivers. 2 time series here illustrating this. There's been an increase in the temperature. There has been a decrease in the area covered by sea ice. We both know that this can be attributed to anthropogenic impact, and we know a lot. We know that these have large consequences for other parts of the ecosystem. Okay, so then let's take a brief look at the cumulative evidence from the knowledge base of the indicators, that climate change is identified as a potentially important driver for more than 80% of the indicators in the assessment. Okay, so when we then look at the assessment result for all the 7 ecosystem characteristics. So on top, abiotic factors, there is evidence of substantial impact from anthropogenic drivers there. The same also for landscape ecological patterns, because these are defined by the abiotic factors. It's area of sea ice, for example. So the other ones are the ones that are assessed with the biological time series. And there we see only evidence of limited impact or no evidence of impact. So the conclusion for the assessment as a whole is that as a whole there is intermediate evidence of intermediate impact from anthropogenic drivers on the Arctic part of the Norwegian part of the Barents Sea shelf ecosystem. But important caveat here. Most of the biological time series, they cover the period 2004 to 2020, which is a period with little net change in climate, the main driver. So therefore, we do not know whether many of these indicators have indeed changed from the period, for example, from 1970 and through the whole period of warming, because we don't have data covering that. That means that the conclusion of intermediate impact comes with high uncertainty. The next thing we have to do before we're going to redo this assessment in this year and the coming year is to look more closely at the covariation between, for example, temperature and the biological indicators for the period that we have data, and do more statistical modeling of that to be able to reduce the uncertainty and maybe have another conclusion to the overall assessment. Okay, that was what I had. Thank you.
I believe you are allowed to answer a couple of questions. If we have any from the other, we have one question down there.
Hi, thank you for an interesting presentation. And my question is, I feel like you were looking at a lot of indicators as parts, but we know that like parts make up a whole, but also the whole has other emergent properties. So I'm wondering how you're going to consider that if that's being considered in the next round, sort of assessing the whole as the whole.
Yeah, so that is why we are using the concept of ecosystem characteristics, because we're kind of integrating things to a sub-whole within the ecosystem characteristics, and then to the whole by using for the whole ecosystem through the ecosystem characteristics. And all the way through the assessment, we explicitly consider how the different parts of the ecosystem are affecting each other. So the aspiration is to have an assessment of the ecosystem as a whole, and in the final assessment, the scientific panel use explicit the knowledge about the importance of the different components of the ecosystem, how they contribute to the dynamics of the ecosystem as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another very quick question? Nah. Then we'll move on. Okay. Thank you, Per. The next speaker will be Justine Remars. She will be giving a talk on the Arctic Permafrost Vulnerability Index that she developed. Thank you.
Hello. Oops. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to the Arctic Permafrost Vulnerability Index, and to actually bring you from the sea to the land. So this is the permafrost, the current permafrost extent. Permafrost is one major component of the cryosphere, and it's frozen ground. that is defined as ground that is at or below 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 consecutive years. So the permafrost that is currently here is a relict from the past climate. And it covers roughly 25% of the northern hemisphere, and it's found both on land, but also in the continental shelf. So, as we have heard already since many decades, and we've heard again with yesterday with the launch of the AMAP assessment, the Arctic is warming, and the amplified increase in Arctic temperature accelerate the thaw of permafrost. This is a model showing the current extent of permafrost and the future for this permafrost. So the region that you have here in orange are where permafrost is currently present and will disappear by the year 2100. The areas that are marked in red here are places where permafrost will, the temperature of the ground will increase, so permafrost will just become warmer and destabilize. So the ground on which people live and animals live is no longer solid, and this has, of course, important consequences for the whole climate system, but also for people living directly on it. So I've been focusing my research in the past years into understanding the impact of permafrost thaw on livelihood. And in that context, we developed the Arctic Permafrost Vulnerability Index. So the goal with this index was to inform stakeholders on the vulnerabilities to permafrost thaw across the Arctic in the permafrost region, and to kind of start initiating a dialogue on adaptation solutions. So the index is composed of 19 different indicators that are actually grouped into 2 different sub-indexes. So an index that represents the exposure to permafrost thaw. So these are like more physical indicators of illustrating conditions of the soil, landscapes, infrastructure, and health in the permafrost region. And we also have data on the adaptive capacity. So how to this data that allows, socioeconomic data, sorry, that allows us to understand how communities, or I mean here we work at the sub-regional scale because of the data we have, are capable to react to this change, to these changes. So we have a different indicator grouped into economic, knowledge, and demographic capacities. So we had 2 of these indexes that we merged to create the Permafrost Vulnerability Index. So these are the results of the Vulnerability Index, and as you see, everything is kind of in yellow-orange color. This means that most of the region have a high vulnerability to permafrost thaw. Regions that are in greener color show that regions that have a moderate vulnerability to permafrost thaw, and the ones in red show high vulnerability. We did not identify any region with no vulnerability to permafrost thaw. I illustrate here like 3 examples of 3 sub-regions scores. So the first region called Region 1 in Canada, which is actually one of, it's on the Inuvialuit land, has a score of 2.5, so it's highly vulnerable to permafrost thaw. And this is because it has a very high or high exposure to permafrost thaw. We have large, like we have a continuous permafrost with a large amount of ground ice in the ground, and we have a high susceptibility to abrupt thaw, which is like a quick thawing of the ground. And in this region, there is a medium adaptive capacity to respond to these changes. And this is mainly driven by lower economic capacity. In the Avanata municipality in West Greenland, we also have a moderate or medium adaptive capacity, again, because of economic capacity to react to the changes. But since there is a low exposure to permafrost thaw, we don't have as much permafrost and not as much ground ice in the ground, then the vulnerability index is not as strong. And one of the regions where the vulnerability is the highest is Svalbard. And this was a bit surprising for us, but Svalbard is highly exposed to permafrost thaw. And at the same time, although it has quite high economic capacity to answer to these changes, the demographic capacity is quite imbalanced, and that's why it has a low overall capacity, adaptive capacity to respond to these changes. So of course, this is an index. It has a lot of limitation, and I just want to point towards a few of them. So first of all, we had to set thresholds for each of these indicators with the question in mind, like what is a threshold that would show or indicate that a community is vulnerable to permafrost thaw? So that was a very tedious work, and I think we managed, but it's still not perfect. We also have issue, of course, of data availability. It's a pan-Arctic study. We had most of our data was socioeconomic data available at the subarctic sub-regional scale. But some data is missing, especially when looking at more the local capacity. And as an index, it has a top-down approach. So we are using indicators to inform on local capacities. So we're totally missing the local perspective here. So now to answer this bigger difficulty here, we are now integrating the local knowledge and indigenous knowledge by mapping permafrost ecosystem services. So we are doing participatory mapping to understand how people are using the land and how the changes in this land can affect their own activities. And hopefully we can bring in that way the local perspective into the bigger picture. So thank you very much. If you want to know more about the detail of this index, we have a publication that should hopefully be soon released. And I would like to welcome all of you to join our effort in mapping permafrost ecosystem services in the future. You can contact me at the address that is here. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. There are time for a question or two. Yeah, we have one here in the front.
Sindre Langås from the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. I was a bit puzzled with the three case examples you showed there on one of the slides, where Svalbard apparently has a low adaptive capacity, and I was wondering why this is so compared to the Greenland and the Canadian case.
Yes, thank you for your question. So I think that reveals actually the kind of the weaknesses of the index, and that's why I wanted to point it here. So as I mentioned, Svalbard has a high economic capacity, although it has a kind of disbalance. We also take into account the representation of all economic branches, which is not very balanced for the case of Svalbard. But it has a low demographic capacity. In the sense that, I mean, when we set up thresholds, for example, one of the key threshold was that we have a good representation of each age. So we have, for example, on Svalbard, a lack of old age people. So what does that mean in terms of adaptive capacity to permafrost? So it's like this question, and that's why I highlighted some of the limitation and the need to work further on these thresholds to make the index more adapted.
Thank you so much, Justine. I'm afraid that we have to have, there was another question, but we have to take that later in the break. Yeah, the last speaker here is coming up, Stephen Crooks. From the Yeah, you know what? You can do it yourself. Please welcome Stephen Crooks.
Hello. Yes, so my name is Steve. I am from the Arctic Institute of North America, which is at the University of Calgary. This is a very wordy title, I apologize, but basically I'm part of a team that's looking to bring together complementary sources of knowledge to guide the potential pathway to forge utility of applying genomics tools or DNA-based tools for the service of Arctic ecosystems. Specifically, we have a focus on food security, biosecurity. Food security means vouchsafing the longevity of various harvestable bioresources in the Arctic, such as beluga or caribou. And biosecurity is we want to retain the ecological integrity of the North in the face of climate change by trying to mitigate or stop the invasion of pathogens or invasive species. So basically this project is the intersection of two major knowledge systems in humanity. We have indigenous knowledge, which is the lived-in experience of mostly Inuit with whom we deal. And, oops, that went back, I went for a little bit too far. And Western science. Now, I am obviously representing Western science. I am a first-generation immigrant to Canada, and I look like an 18th century trapper, so I have all the trappings of European colonialism. Part of the project is to decolonize science in Canada and in the Arctic. But I am a geneticist by training, so I am partly funded by the Earth Biogenome Project, which is a very ambitious project to generate whole genome sequences for all eukaryotic taxa on planet Earth that we know of, because there's clearly going to be a lot more that we don't. And Canada Biogenome Project is the Canadian arm of that. But also, any tools that we develop need to be applied ethically, so we have a strong ethical, social, and legal component. So any goals that we have, which are to develop potential genomic-based tools to monitor biodiversity in the Arctic, have to be in the service of communities. If communities are not engaged and do not wish to use them, fair dues, fair dinkum, but our aim is to try and encourage these tools to be considered. So by working with communities, we need to be cognizant of various aspects of working as southern scientists in the Arctic. We need to listen to ecosystem priorities. What are the needs of local Inuit and First Nations and Métis populations in Arctic Canada? We need to incorporate their lived-in experience and their observational data. They have generations of data of biodiversity and taxonomic richness in various Arctic and subarctic environments. Part of my job is to promote the understanding of sometimes on somewhat esoteric genetic concepts pertaining to tools, to communities, which is not an easy task when our languages are very different. So Inuktitut is a very different set of languages than English and French in Canada. We also need to develop accessible tools, that any genomics tools that are developed can be placed in the hands of communities, and they have access to data that is interpretable and useful in their everyday lives. And we need to respect and adhere to principles of IQ, Inuit knowledge systems and way of knowings. So part of the way we do this, and working towards consensus, is to workshop. We are part of a wider project in which we're dealing with, or we're working with groups across Canada, First Nations groups and Métis and Inuit. And some of our colleagues are working on totemic taxa in the south, such as the long-toed salamander, and one of my favorites, the Massasauga rattlesnake. But I am part of the Arctic team, so we need a paragon for the Arctic as a way of a gateway to highlight what genomics tools are possible and how they might be used in an Arctic context. So we need to meet some certain minimal criteria. Needs to have cultural significance. Sorry, just cut off the end there, but significance is that word. Needs to be part of a country food. That's a food that is traditionally consumed through hunting and harvesting in the Arctic. There needs to be significant knowledge gaps, essentially mostly genetics, for which genomics tools might be developed, but also from its ecology and conservation. Should be an emblem of the Arctic. There should ideally be a bilateral partnerships already in place, because that makes my job a lot easier. And it's in the Arctic, threatened by climate change. So here we have the muskox. That was what was chosen in various dialects of Inuktitut. It's called the Umingamak. So our first job was to set up an in-person meeting and in the communities with which we will be working. So we chose to have a community meeting called MAGIC, which stands for Muskox or Muskoxen and Genomics in the Community. This was held in Cambridge Bay in the Canadian Arctic Peninsula just over a year ago. And various people from around the Arctic Peninsula, various Inuit populations attended, mostly representing elders, municipal officers, and harvesters. But also we had academic scientists, government scientists, and southern economic interests. A lot of people farm muskox in Alaska, and the underfur of muskox, kiviat, is a very valuable commodity, which is sold in posh shops in Banff National Park. So this diagram is basically showing what happened at that event. We started off with an opening and blessing ceremony. That was followed by various elders and harvesters sharing their knowledge of their relationship with muskox and its environment. Especially over the decades, their first-hand experience of climate change was really brought to bear. They don't need convincing of the reality of climate change, unlike a lot of Westerners do. And that was followed by rather much more drier presentations like this one by a lot of the Western or Southern scientists in tow. And then we had various breakout groups and face-to-face discussions. I identified priorities for communities, for the different communities in the Arctic, determining where genomic tools might be useful. For example, monitoring of diseases, invasive species, that kind of thing. Then we had a practical set of practical interactive modules whereby knowledge was shared between Western and Indigenous attendees. And then we had a closing social and feast where we were very lucky to eat caribou and Arctic char in a traditional way. So here is a graphic that just basically shows the process of generating knowledge from this meeting. This inner wheel represents all the knowledge that all the attendees brought to the meeting, including Indigenous and Western. For example, the lived experience of muskox ecology that's changed over the years, the importance of muskox. I introduced some foundational aspects of genetics and hereditary science, and also what genomics work has already been done in muskox and various and similar large terrestrial mammals. Caribou especially has attracted a lot, and Arctic foxes, which are popular in Norway. So this knowledge was directed and filtered through a set of objectives, and I won't go through the entire wheel, but one of the major aims of this project was to identify species in the ecosystem of the muskox for whole genome sequencing by the Earth Biogenome Project. And this outer wheel was a set of objectives, some of them more tangible than others, but I'll just go through a couple. We identified some DNA-based tools that could be used almost immediately, like environmental DNA. I'm sure there's a session on that coming up. And one of the select species for whole genome sequencing. And to do that, we generated, using traditional ecological knowledge, this model of the muskox ecosystem. And like most models, this is simplified, but it highlights the essential relationships that the community members would like to have focused, have their focus on any genomics tools that might be applied. I won't go through this now, but it should be in a paper coming out at some point early in 2025. And as I said, one of the major goals of this project was to identify species of whole genome sequencing. Now, these are just animals, mostly vectors of disease or suspected repositories of disease. Brucellosis, and there's a disease called ER, which is short for a word I can't pronounce, Erythropelotrix, I think, which is causing significant mortality in muskox. So a lot of these things are mostly reservoirs, so a lot of seals, polar bears, a lot of these voles and lemmings are associated with muskox herbivory, so might be optimal targets. This is only a part of a series of workshops we hope to hold. We did hold another workshop in Halifax last year, and we're going to hold one in Kuujjuaq in Nunavik, Northern Quebec in March, which is this one. If you're interested in attending this or being involved, let me know. I would like to thank all our Indigenous participants, without whom we could not possibly do any of this. And thank you. Ta.
Right.
right on time, Steve, and you're lucky you're the last one, so I will allow a question or two if there's any.
Catch me at any time.
Is this? Oh, yeah.
The mic? Yeah.
Thank you for this awesome talk. One question I had is, so you're doing these genetic surveys, and you were talking about making the data like interpretable and accessible for these communities. What kind of data or conclusions are you passing along? Like what can they take out of that and apply to their daily lives?
So one of the basic tenets of whatever I do is not to overpromise. There are some aspects of tools, not genomics-based tools, but DNA-based tools like eDNA, where you can use that to monitor early incursion into aquatic environments especially, but also now air, snow, all sorts of different environments. That I think we can use and say with some confidence that it can be deployed today. In terms of muskox population genetics and how muskox might adapt to a changing environment, we know very little at the moment. We do have some whole reference genomes, most of them just published in the last year, but we don't know much about immunogenetics or the distribution of population of very limited genetic variation, which we know muskox have very little of it because of various population crashes in the last few Pleistocene climate fluctuations. But they're in a better state than caribou, I know that. Caribou have inbreeding depression, whereas muskox seemingly don't. But how they can adapt through natural selection to the future, we don't know yet. So we need to develop these tools, and we're at the very early stages, so I don't tend to overpromise. That's a long waffling answer. That didn't answer very much, but...
That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Steve. I do hope that everybody will use the lunch break now to see the speakers we have had in the session, if you have any more questions. Otherwise, I'll come back to where you can approach them again. I first want to thank everybody for their talks in this session. It's been very broad and very insightful, and I really have enjoyed these talks. This afternoon, we will have the second part of this session, which will take place, I'll just say that now, in the Arbeitskontor number 2, I think. And we really hope to see you back then. Here we'll have a keynote speaker that will reflect on the 20 years experience we have in Norway from the ecosystem-based management in the marine system. That will be followed on some presentation on indigenous knowledge integration, lessons from Antarctica governance that can be brought to the Arctic, we hope, and the transboundary restoration efforts in politically sensitive context. Okay. Yeah, this subsession will also be closed with a panel discussion, taking on some of the speakers from this session and some of the speakers from the second subsession. So I hope that I'll see a lot of you back at 3:30 this afternoon. Thank you.